The most important part in determining the status of a video game franchise is the first sequel, the second game of a series. It's not always the most important part in determining the legacy of a franchise, but it's always the most crucial part about its future, because it serves as the direction to nudge all future games in, and which elements from the original are going to be included or not. If the gameplay and general concept of a first sequel is basically more of the original, the series has to respond to that by either continuing its trajectory or by making something new. If it builds on its format or changes it, that can often shape the future of a series as well. And if the franchise decides to not carry on anything established by the first sequel, that's still a massive mark on the franchise that game made by choosing to return to its roots. Really, the second entry of a franchise is where it becomes a franchise, so obviously it's the most important part. That's why I've developed a bit of a weird obsession with the terrible twos of a video game franchise. The sequels that people write off for drastically changing a bunch of aspects that the developers almost immediately backpedal on with the threequel. The sequels to a critically acclaimed franchise that everybody wants to forget about. Because for every Sonic 2, Uncharted 2, Half-Life 2, Silent Hill 2, Street Fighter 2, Streets of Rage 2, Left 4 Dead 2, Marvel vs. There's not exactly the same amount of universally hated sequels as universally beloved ones, but they're there. Rare, but totally noticeable. There are plenty of Castlevania 2 Simon's Quests out there. And that's what I want to talk about today, because these sequels that people have shoved under the rug fascinate me. I will be looking at the most common criticisms I've found about 3 of those such games here. There's a few rules about the games I'm covering that I want to establish though. These are strictly stuff that are almost universally seen as bad, or just extremely divisive by the fan base. Most of these games have their fans of course, but the prevailing narrative has to be, we don't talk about these Lomao. That's not exactly the case with Metal Gear Solid 2, for example, anymore. Look at an example of something like the Vatican II. Everyone thinks it's a great sequel, but lots of people don't think it's a good sequel, but everyone does think it's a good sequel, so the Vatican II is the type of thing I would not be covering here, if it was a video game. I want to find out why these games earn their reputation, and any other interesting parts about it I might find by looking at their criticisms directly. I'm also going to be sticking to sequels that were presented as sequels, and that you can plainly and without uncertainty call them sequels. So a follow-up to a console game on a handheld probably won't be discussed here. Speaking of handhelds, sequels that are going to be hard to compare to the original due to having limited hardware aren't going to be here. So like Metroid 2 Return of Samus won't be here due to its Game Boy OSD. Let's start with the first game to be discussed, Final Fantasy II. I really like the original Final Fantasy. It's bare bones, but something about it really speaks to me. It's a good length and difficulty. It surprisingly doesn't need too much grinding to get good at all. The story is almost non-existent, but there's a nice fantasy world full of whimsy and some surprisingly high fantasy stuff like dwarves, elves, and ancient people of the sky who speak an unknown language. The plot even has a weird time travel loop at the end. It's flawed, but a really good game in my opinion. Then came the extremely divisive sequel. Despite Final Fantasy II being the first Final Fantasy game to have a more in-depth story, and to include pre-made characters and chocobos, it's still seen as really controversial among the fanbase, and Final Fantasy III went back to fully customizable non-named characters afterwards. It essentially became Final Fantasy I Remake. Let's look at some of the reasons why. Before we do though, full disclosure, I will be playing the updated Game Boy Advance re-release. The game does get a new epilogue in that version, but I won't be reviewing that. The GBA version is where I first played Final Fantasy I, so I figure it would be the most charitable. From what I see online, this Game Boy version hardly fixes the game. So here's the issues I found were raised about Final Fantasy II. Number 1, the level up system. This is the biggest one by far, and it's because this game completely uproots how the RPG leveling up system works. Instead of gaining XP through each win, your attack raises by dealing damage, your magic level increases by dealing magic, and you get HP by tanking hits. meaning to grind, you have to punch yourself over and over again. This creates a really odd system with wonky progression, and it's just difficult to see where your strengths lie. I'll be honest, that sounds absolutely insane. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays in the game. Number 2. The objectives are confusing. So, the original Final Fantasy absolutely suffered from this problem to a degree, but this game is just super confusing. Directives are often unclear, and you can very easily find yourself wandering into an area that's too high level by mistake, and being crushed by high level enemies. This also applies to dungeons which have way too many random useless dead ends, although that is a thing in Final Fantasy 1 as well. That's basically it actually. This game definitely does have its fans, those freaks, but that leveling up system seems really bizarre, and I'm curious to see if it'll be the deal breaker it's made out to be. I can say this though, this has the coolest Final Fantasy logo of all. Not that one. Yeah, look at that. This looks like the logo for a band the worst person on Earth listens to. There will be spoilers for the game, by the way, so if you really care, which doesn't actually matter that much, you can skip this section, but I won't go too in-depth with the story. So if you are interested in playing Final Fantasy II, I don't think this ruins it at all. Okay, so I would say if you enjoy the first Final Fantasy game, there's fun to be had in the sequel. It's not completely irredeemable, but it does have lots of pretty significant missteps, and annoyances that aren't just limited to the leveling up system. Let's talk about that system actually. In the early game, the system is a quick adjustment, and fairly intuitive to get used to in a couple of regards. It's not too difficult to grasp the concept that attacking more makes you stronger. You need to become proficient in each weapon individually, which makes it so that your lances, axes, and swords aren't exactly as interchangeable as they were before. It also means that in order to get health, you need to take damage and stay at low health, which makes battles much riskier. The image of a party constantly punching themselves in the middle of a battle definitely can happen, but it isn't as common as you might think if you want to get stronger. Where the system really starts to sour the experience is with the magic and MP level. You have to individually level up each spell, so you'll need to be using them what feels like an arbitrary amount, and it's not really that fun when MP levels up so slowly. It makes it so that in the late game, I'm not excited at all to get new spells. That includes the super secret elusive Ultima spell. A big part of the game is dedicated to trying to find it, and it just turns out to be an average level 1 white magic damage spell. They risk copyright infringement for this. Later on, this game's leveling up system was actually implemented in the Saga series, which is a sort of spin-off of Final Fantasy. I think it works much better there, because that game has multiple selectable campaigns, like Live Alive or Octopath Traveler, and so your resources aren't going to be stretched out too much. In this game, it makes for one of my least favorite turn-based battle systems in any RPG I've played ever. I do have to mention though, there's a lot of things that can only be described as silly. Funny little ways to cheese the game. There's a spell called Swap that literally swaps MP and HP with the opponent. It worked on at least one boss for me, allowing for a really easy victory. There's even a spell called Teleport, which can allow you to teleport enemies away, instantly defeating them if it hits. There's a sword called the Blood Sword, which deals 1/16 of an opponent's health, and always lets you heal that back. It made for the easiest non-Pokemon RPG final boss for me. And do you know what I had to do to get this sword? Go to a guy's house and talk to him. The point is, Final Fantasy II is cheesable, in a really funny way, and some of its spells are batshit insane, and weirdly designed by their very concepts. I'm just glad it's Final Fantasy II in particular that's so broken, to be honest. Now, the second point about this game being aimless has some truth to it, but I think it's much more deeper than that. It's not really that much more aimless than any other classic RPG, but it definitely feels way more so. This game has a way more in-depth story than Final Fantasy I did, and it tries to implement some player choice in it. Meaning to progress the story, you have to learn certain key words from NPCs, and ask others about them later. it can be cumbersome to figure out what specific terms to ask to progress the story at times, and it can result in situations where you think you've done everything right so far, but you venture on, and then, oops, sorry, you didn't ask a random dude about the dragoons, so go back please. It takes a long time to get free access to the airship too, so there's lots of walking around that gets annoying. And you'll almost always have to circle back to the castle to talk to the princess or someone once you're done a quest, so this game does get really repetitive. At least grinding isn't much of an issue though, as long as you can prioritize what to level up, that is. Dungeons, on the other hand, are full of dead ends and unintuitive paths forward, and I would definitely recommend consulting a map if you're going to play them. Again, I would say the same thing about the first Final Fantasy though, so it's not really a misstep for the franchise. There are these new trapdoors though. They lead to empty rooms with jacked up enemy encounters, and they are a staple of dungeons in this game, which is ironic as I would rather get a staple in my forearm than play another RPG with these in it. It's easy to underestimate the impact of Final Fantasy II on the rest of the franchise, but it is way bigger than you'd expect. This is the debut of chocobos, evil emperors, Cid, dragoons, enemies like Malboros and bombs, and really, it's the first game to have a more in-depth story mode, with fleshed out characters and named protagonists. Contrary to popular opinion, this first sequel was not abandoned, even if Final Fantasy III took it back to the series' roots, and brought back the job system. Actually, come to think of it, if Final Fantasy III is an update of 1, I'd consider Final Fantasy IV to be a sort of remake of 2. Funny considering Final Fantasy IV was eventually titled Final Fantasy II and then Scott Pilgrim learned the baseline from it. Final Fantasy IV brought back named characters, and both games feature a fight against an evil empire, a dragoon with the last name Highwind, a fourth party spot that alternates characters, and a Dark Knight who gets redeemed and ends up as a good guy at the end. Those things are really iconic parts about Final Fantasy IV too, which is considered one of the best of the franchise, and it's really cool that they're clearly an evolution of ideas introduced in Final Fantasy II. Plus, the transformation from a genocidal Dark Knight to a paladin is much more powerful in Final Fantasy IV when it gets the attention it deserves, rather than Leon in Final Fantasy II, which got like 2 lines, I imagine. So it's a pretty simple case. The critiques of Final Fantasy II are, for the most part, true, and I wish it was more like the traditional Final Fantasy experience. But that doesn't tell the whole story here, because its mark on the series is massive, and it influenced RPGs in profound ways as well. There's some early Squaresoft charm, and I'd give it a shot if you're interested in Final Fantasy history for sure. It's a crazy, goofy, broken part of Final Fantasy history, and it not being as good as other games shouldn't relegate it to a footnote in the franchise's history. If you're familiar with its quirks, it's not that bad to play, which you are familiar with now, if you're on the Pixel remaster, that is, or any remake. And in terms of 80s RPGs, I'm sure you could get many more frustrating experiences. Also, shout out to the Chocobo music in this game. It's so bad. It's so painful because it was just a 5-second loop. The rest of the game has great music though, obviously. I especially like the theme they gave to most mini-bosses in the game. It's got a weird atmosphere you don't really expect for boss battles. So there we go, my verdict on Final Fantasy II. I think it's a little bit unfair that its influence is largely relegated to factoids nowadays. Hey, did you know this is the game where chocobos are from? But this next one is a game I've played before, and I think I can say little pieces of trivia probably are its biggest legacy. And believe me, it's an extremely controversial game too. It released just a couple years before Final Fantasy II did in Japan. I wonder if that'll be enough of a hint for you guys to get it. I'm talking about Super Mario Bros. 2, aka Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. Yes, I will be beating this game all the way through on my own, no outside you know what? I will play with some restore points, but only some. It would be my greatest honor as a content creator if someone were to learn the story of why Japan and America got two different Super Mario Bros. 2s for the very first time because of me. Basically, not too long after Super Mario Bros. 1 released on NES, Nintendo made a sequel, presumably with the intent of being a harder version of the game for those who have already beaten it, because it's infamously brutal. So brutal that some have said the game feels like you're being trolled. I mean, remember the warp zones from Super Mario Bros., right? This game has those, except they just make you go to previous levels. What the fuck? Eventually, when it was considered for localization, it was declared so brutal, it might actually damage the brand recognition of Mario in the West. Luckily, Nintendo had recently made a game called Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic for a channel called Fuji TV, which had a lot of elements inspired by Mario, so they said screw it, and reskinned that game with Mario characters, and called it Super Mario Bros. 2. This game was later released under the name Super Mario USA in Japan, and while it's not the most conventional Mario game, it's still seen as a valued part of the series. It introduced stuff like ball bombs, ninjas, and Birdo, which were in a lot of games after it. It was even the first time Princess Peach was playable. As for the Japanese version of Mario 2, well, poison mushrooms were introduced in it. That's not to suggest sequels are only valuable because of what they introduced to the series. Sonic 2 is good because it's an evolution of the first game, not because Tails and Super Sonic are in it. I'm just saying it's telling us to what this game's legacy is. The first time it was released in North America was in the Super Mario All-Stars collection for Super Nintendo under the name Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, which is a way cooler name than you'd think. That goes so hard. For years, the general consensus on this situation is that people in America were really pissed off. How dare you insist Nintendo games are too hard for Americans, they said. Then everyone shut up when they actually started to play the game and realized the absolute depths of brutality this game featured, and they stopped complaining. Yes, this is the game I'm going to be reviewing today. To be clear, I don't mind the idea of a Mario sequel like this, that stretches the difficulty to its absolute limit, but I am glad for what happened, because Doki Doki Panic likely would have been really obscure anyways. Really, it releasing under the name Super Mario Bros. 2 was where most of its problems lie. If it wasn't marketed that way, I think it would have been received better. That was its title though, and it's clear it was intended to be a sequel, so I'll look at it that way. Here are two big points I've seen made about this game. Number 1, troll stuff. This game's difficulty isn't just limited to unfair jumps. It's an almost constant stream of level design that requires trial and error to get to know, like poison mushrooms that look annoyingly like 1-ups did in the original game, or the aforementioned troll warp zones. This game isn't simply made up of the harder later levels of Super Mario Bros. It's an official early prototype of the worst Mario Maker levels you've ever played. Number 2, unreasonable jumps. Yeah, I didn't want to give off the impression by that comment in the last point that unreasonable jumps don't exist. There's several points in the game where you're expected to make jumps where you're being hit by extremely aggressive wind, have limited visibility, or need to jump between multiple flying Koopas or something to get to a goal. There's tons of super unreasonable jumps in the game, and lots of moments of low visibility. Those are the things I'll keep in the back of my mind while playing, to see if they're true or not. I will also be playing the original NES version of the game, not the remake, since the original version of Super Mario Bros. Is what I'm familiar with. I'll also just be calling it Super Mario Bros. 2 as we go along. As cool as the Lost Levels sounds. I will maintain that Super Mario Bros. 2's first half, worlds 1 to 4, are well designed. They're extremely challenging, and not as good as the original, but it's still an interesting challenge that ramps up from it. My favorite parts are when the game does a sort of remix, and plays with the rules of the original, like having bloopers in the overworld or Koopas underwater. There's a sense that you have to think outside the box, which is communicated pretty effectively in the infamous opening, where in order to get a mushroom in its first level, you have to nudge it upwards outside of a little encasing it's in, and then there's a poison mushroom not too long after it. That might sound unfair, but that sort of thinking is exactly what Mario 2 will demand from its players in the future. Eventually, after that fourth world, the difficulty ramps up so aggressively that it's so unbelievably difficult. You'll have to play each world what feels like 100 times over to get to know it. Luckily, you can continue from the start of each world, which is a luxury the original Super Mario Bros. Does give you, but it's hidden in that game through a cheat code. It's explicitly a feature in this game. As for those two major critiques of this game, they're basically true. Poison mushrooms I'm fine with. There's still plenty of regular mushrooms and power-ups to find if you look hard enough, but the warp zones that set you back is just absurd to me. It feels like it discourages you from looking for secrets and experimenting with the game, and it's not really congruent with that think outside the box mentality of this game. The comparison to Kaizo Mario is exaggerated, but I would be lying if I said it didn't feel like the game was trying to screw with you at times. You know those levels in the original Super Mario Bros., the few of them that were puzzles, looping around back if you didn't complete it? Well, those were confusing and overly complicated for me, and I hated them. They're ramped up in this game, and it was so frustrating. Lack of clarity and visibility with jumps, that's the main issue with this game. You'll frequently have to make leaps of faith, jumps making use of multiple moving entities, or even just aimlessly searching for an invisible block before you move forward. It makes for one of the most brutal non-action platforming experiences possible. The two big criticisms were basically completely true for the latter half of the game, and really, I don't know how many ways there are to say it's way too difficult, but when I think about it further and further, sure, this game is primarily meant for you to torture yourself, but when you reframe it a little, is that really a bad thing? In his defense of Dark Souls 2, another very controversial I'm not talking about here, the YouTuber H-Bomber guy casually compared the updated Scholar of the First Sin re-release to Super Mario Bros. 2, and that made me realize some interesting parallels between those two releases, in that they have really misleading market. Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin, presented itself as an updated re-release of Dark Souls 2, with all the DLC included, but in reality it drastically changed enemy placements, making for a much more difficult, unfair, and poorly designed experience, within the same world and structure as Dark Souls 2. Many people, myself included, were duped into buying Scholar of the First Sin first, and judging base Dark Souls 2 by a more frustrating product. That's not too dissimilar from Super Mario Bros. 2. Look, in 1986, they probably didn't realize it, but the number 2 on the title of a game is very loaded. When you think of Mario 2 as a remix version of the original, stretching out its design philosophy for an unbelievable challenge made for super players, it's an interesting idea. It isn't perfect, because it's still very BS, but it's part of the experience, and if you look at it under that lens, it's easy to laugh with it, not at it. It's got the same price point as the original 2, which could definitely be an issue. I think Super Mario Bros. 2 is a lesson in marketing, and setting expectations for players. Cause if this was called Super Mario Bros. Super Challenge or something, it probably wouldn't have sold as well in Japan, but it communicates what it is way better than the already existing name. And hey, maybe it would actually release over here too. As it stands, Super Mario Bros. 2 is an interesting, bizarre, imperfect, and kinda dumb part of Mario history that was marketed terribly. I've seen some people say it sucks or it's terrible, but that feels disingenuous to me, and there's a bigger story behind it. We never would have gotten Super Mario USA in that situation though, and its elements probably wouldn't have returned, which is a weird alternative universe to think about. Also, this is actually the first Mario game with a special world. That's a big deal. If you're doing that silly thing where you judge a sequel simply based on how much it contributes to the series, there's more than just a troll mushroom that got into Smash Bros. Here. It's also when Luigi's physics were changed too. That's actually pretty important, even if I agree it's not the better or even the real Mario 2, whatever that means. So now that we've talked about two old-ass games, let's talk about a sequel to a much more recent game. It's still a classic styled game, but it is from the 21st century at least. I'm talking about Super Meat Boy Forever. The first Super Meat Boy is one of the greatest indie games of all time. Even if I don't see many people talk about it nowadays, it's a really precise platformer at a super fast speed, and it's an absolutely addicting experience. 10 years after the original game was released, a sequel came out called Super Meat Boy Forever. People didn't like it as much. Now, it is somewhat up in the air if Super Meat Boy Forever really counts as the first sequel. The first Super Meat Boy was based on a Newgrounds game called Meat Boy, so you might be able to call Super Meat Boy the first sequel. I still think Forever counts under the conditions of this video though, because an actual commercial product is a bit different from a short free flash game, so I'll talk about it anyways. Plus, there's a Super Metroid parody in Super Meat Boy Forever, and it refers to the game as Super Meat Boy 2. So, it counts by their admission, not mine. So, let's look at some of the big critiques of this sequel, that I don't really think makes the Meat Boy series last forever. Number 1, Auto Runner. In the original Super Meat Boy, you're mostly running, sure, but you could just move normally like any platformer. Meat Boy Forever changes this, instead making it an auto runner, meaning there's a lot less control in its controls. That does sound a little lame when I hear it, but you know, I'm gonna give it a shot anyways, even if it's very different from the original Super Meat Boy. Number 2, difficulty balancing. Lots of people don't really like the difficulty balancing of Super Meat Boy Forever, feeling it's poorly balanced and has some odd difficulty spikes. The original Super Meat Boy was known for its difficulty, so it's an important part of the series. Parts of the levels are auto-generated too, meaning there's a bit less precision in how they're designed. Really, Super Meat Boy just isn't the sequel people expected, and the mobile game allegations are endless. This game was made in a post-Celeste world too, so, you know, there's lots of scrutiny placed in this genre, now that games inspired by Meat Boy have managed to be really, really good. And better than Super Meat Boy, let's be real here. The original series creator Edmund McMillan also wasn't involved in this game, so that could play a part as well. Is this rare type of sequel well done, or is it just medium? Or medium rare? You know what, let's just play the damn game. Look, I get why they made it an auto runner. Tons of ideas were exhausted in the original Super Meat Boy, and by making it an auto runner, new ideas can arise from that. For the most part, the gameplay captures the crushing yet fair difficulty of the original, and there were lots of new mechanics introduced. You might find a gem that gives you a double jump, or a teleport ability, and it makes the platforming feel interesting. For the most part, it's a well-designed game. That said, when I think about the neat ideas and mechanics this game introduced, I think, damn, I wish this was in Super Meat Boy. Sure, the auto-runner nature of the game isn't a deal-breaker, but there's still less freedom in how you can play, and the solutions to its platforming challenges overall don't feel as clever to me compared to the original. Barring a few exceptions, this game doesn't really play to its own strengths, and this new mechanic just simplifies things if anything. Those exceptions are there though, and yeah, there absolutely are plenty of moments where the path forward is clever, and couldn't really be done in the original Super Meat Boy. But they don't really feel as consistent as that game was. Good, but not consistent, is a good way to describe the game in general. Speaking of inconsistencies, I saw points being made about the difficulty being inconsistent, which I didn't really see in the game at all. The game has a few less levels than the original, but they're much longer and have checkpoints before their major platforming challenges, meaning there's essentially a bunch of levels in one, and they are indeed balanced perfectly fine. The only real difficulty spikes were in the bosses I found, but you dodged them plenty in Super Meat Boy 2. The auto-generation comes in the spaces between those handcrafted challenges, because it's usually randomly generated. It's a small part of the game though, and I actually kind of forgot this was in the game. Meat Boy Forever starts by having you generate a seed, and I was like, oh, that's weird. only to completely forget I had done that later, since the game doesn't feel randomly generated at all. I'm okay with how they did it, honestly. I would say the visual style is also a pretty big departure. There's more of a hand-drawn style in the gameplay than the distinct darker look in the first game. Both are valid styles, to be honest, and both games feel like they have their own identities. This game's got some cute animations while keeping Meat Boy's Newgrounds gross-out humor. I mean, the villain of the series is Dr. Fetus. I kinda don't like that, not because it's too gross or edgy for me, it just reminds me of something I'd do when I was 14. This game's badness is pretty overblown. It's a fun game that took some missteps, and that's kinda the most I can say about it. People do really hate this experience, but it's hardly as bad as people say, once you think of it as a puzzle instead of simply a precise platforming like the original. It's a decent experience, that's all I can really say about it. Decent. It definitely wasn't the sequel people expected, which doesn't sound like a problem until you realize it would be better if it was the sequel people expected. There's something sad about Super Meat Boy Forever though, more so than the other games, and that is the fact that it's much more uncertain what will happen with the Meat Boy franchise because of it. With the original series creator leaving to work on the 50th Binding of Isaac re-release, this was the game that people saw as the future of the franchise, and now that it got such mixed reviews, it's made Meat Boy less and less known by the general public. It's honestly completely up in the air if there will be another Meat Boy game. Well, besides the spin-off that shortly followed it. And lots of fans have the perception that it killed the franchise. The Meat Boy series just isn't being given the same room to grow that Mario or Final Fantasy had. Having a misstep early on in their lifespan didn't kill those franchises, it just allowed them to feel the terrain and run even faster than they did before. And that's why there's value in those failed first sequels. They allow franchises to make mistakes, and give itself some character. I'm not saying each franchise needs a bad sequel. I'm also not saying each franchise needs a whole bunch of new sequels. I'm just saying these disappointing types of sequels are healthy if we give devs the leniency to make those mistakes. These days, AAA budgets are getting bigger and bigger, and it feels like every franchise is potentially on the chopping block. Any slip-up can cause them to disappear. Even Final Fantasy VII Remake now looks like it's in danger if not continuing. The success stories are on the exact same chopping block as the bad games. All of that is honestly a way bigger topic in the scope of this video though, fuck you Microsoft. The point is to treasure every part of your favorite franchises, even when they do something silly, sometimes that's all that'll last from it. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you later. What in the lost levels are you doing here? Yeah. That was foreshadowing for my next video. I'm tired. You don't even know it yet.